Genevieve never imagined the most painful moment of her life would happen inside a church. Not on a battlefield, not in a hospital, not in some dark, private corner of the world. But right there, under the same stained glass windows she had grown up beneath, surrounded by the same faces that had watched her take her first communion, recite her first scripture, sing in her first choir. She was 32 years old, standing in the back of that sanctuary, when she heard her own father's voice boom through the microphone, steady, righteous, and utterly merciless. He didn't use her name at first. He built up to it, slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants the crowd fully prepared before he delivers the blow. And then he said it, her name, from the pulpit in front of everyone, because she had fallen in love with a widower, a good man, a grieving man. A man her parents had decided was beneath their idea of what her life should look like. Genevieve stood there and absorbed every word. She didn't know yet that 11 million people were about to hear this story too, and that nothing would ever be the same again. What you are about to hear happened inside a place that was supposed to be safe. And the woman at the center of this story stayed silent for a very long time, until she didn't. If you believe that no pulpit, no parent, and no congregation has the right to define your worth, hit subscribe right now. Because Genevieve's story is just getting started, and you need to be here for every single moment of it. My name is Genevieve. I was 32 years old, living in Atlanta, Georgia, and if you had asked anyone who knew me to describe my life in one word, they would have said faithfully. Faithful to my family, faithful to my community, faithful to the church that had shaped every single corner of who I was. I grew up in the kind of household where Sunday was sacred, where grace was said before every meal, where the Bible wasn't just a book on a shelf but the actual framework of daily life. It was beautiful in many ways, but beauty, I would learn, can carry something sharp underneath it, something you don't feel until it cuts. My father, Edmund, was not just a man in our house. He was Pastor Edmund, a title that followed him everywhere, into every room, every conversation, every decision our family ever made. The congregation adored him. Tall, commanding, voice like a thunderstorm wrapped in velvet. My mother Gloria stood beside him like a pillar, elegant, composed, always perfectly positioned. Together they were the image of everything their church celebrated. Devoted, righteous, unshakable. I loved them deeply. I also grew up understanding, very early, that their love came with an architecture specific, structured, and not always easy to live inside. You were expected to fit the design. Questioning the blueprint was simply not something our family did. Here is what most people never understood about me. My faith was real, but it was mine. Not a performance, not a social credential, not something I wore to impress the front pew. When I prayed, it was quiet and personal. When I read scripture, I sat with it honestly, asked hard questions, and let it breathe. That was very different from the version of faith my parents practiced publicly, polished, visible, carefully curated for the congregation's approval. I never said that out loud. Not once. I honored their world while quietly building my own interior one. Two versions of the same belief, living side by side, peacefully, until the day those two worlds collided in a way I never saw coming. I had been volunteering at a community grief support group every other Wednesday for almost 2 years. It was held in a plain room at a local community center, folding chairs, bad coffee, and the kind of honest human pain that strips away every pretense. I was there to help facilitate, to listen, to make people feel less alone in their loss. One Wednesday evening in late February, a man walked in quietly, took a seat near the back, and spent most of the session just listening. He had kind eyes and the particular stillness of someone carrying something very heavy for a very long time. His name was Daniel. He was 38, and he had just lost his wife 14 months earlier. Daniel and I didn't fall in love dramatically. There was no single lightning bolt moment. It grew the way real things grow, slowly, steadily, almost without you noticing, until one day you look up and realize something has taken root. We talked after sessions. Then we talked over coffee. Then long phone calls that stretched past midnight without either of us noticing the time. He was gentle and honest and profoundly good. He was raising his 7-year-old daughter Lily with a tenderness that made my chest ache in the best possible way. He never tried to impress me. He just showed up, consistently, openly, exactly as he was. That, I would discover, was rarer than anything I had ever been taught to look for. I told my parents about Daniel on a Sunday afternoon in April, over the dinner table. I had prepared myself for questions. I had not prepared myself for the temperature of the room dropping that completely, that fast. My father set down his fork. My mother folded her hands. I described Daniel, his kindness, his faith, his devotion to Lily, and then I mentioned he was a widower. The silence that followed was not the silence of people processing information. It was the silence of a verdict already reached. My father said very quietly that a man with that kind of history carried complications our family did not need. My mother said nothing. Her silence, as always, said everything. Daniel proposed on a quiet Thursday evening in his backyard. No grand gesture. Just the two of us, Lily inside watching a movie, the Georgia sky going pink and gold above the tree line. He held my hand and told me that life had taught him not to wait on the things that mattered. I said yes before he finished the sentence. That night, driving home, I felt something I can only describe as wholeness, but underneath it, a quiet dread, because I knew what was coming. I knew my parents, I knew the church. I knew exactly the kind of storm a woman invites when she chooses love that doesn't fit inside someone else's approved design. I chose Daniel anyway, completely, without hesitation. The morning it happened felt completely normal. I dressed carefully, drove to the church I had attended my entire life, and slipped into my usual spot near the back. The sanctuary smelled like it always did: candle wax, old wood, and something floral from the Sunday arrangements near the altar. The choir opened with a hymn I had known since childhood. People greeted each other warmly, the way they always did. Nothing felt different. Nothing felt dangerous. That is the thing about a betrayal delivered in a familiar place. It arrives wearing the face of an ordinary day. You don't see it coming because everything around it looks exactly like it always has. My father opened his sermon with scripture, Proverbs, something about wisdom and discernment. His voice was strong and measured, the congregation leaning in the way they always did when Pastor Edmonds spoke. For the first 15 minutes, it was a normal sermon, then something shifted. Subtly at first, the way weather changes before a storm, a slight drop in temperature that you feel before you understand it. His words began moving away from scripture and towards something more personal, more pointed. He began talking about the dangers of unwise choices, about women who mistake emotion for guidance, about families weakened by decisions made outside of God's order. I felt something cold move through me. I sat very still. He built toward it carefully, layer by layer, the way a practiced speaker constructs an argument he wants to feel inevitable. And then he said my name, clear, deliberate, amplified through the microphone across every pew, every corner, every face in that sanctuary. He told the congregation that his own daughter had chosen to attach herself to a man defined by grief and prior commitment, that she had been counseled and had refused to listen, that her decision reflected a spiritual immaturity that grieved him deeply as both a father and a pastor. He used the word disgrace. Once, but once was more than enough. That word left his mouth and landed directly in the center of my chest like something physical. I looked at my mother instinctively, the way you look toward the person who has always been your second anchor when the first one fails you. Gloria was seated in the front pew, straight-backed, hands folded neatly in her lap. She was not visibly distressed. She was not trying to signal anything to me across the room. She was simply still, composed, and present in the way she always was during my father's sermons. And that stillness was its own kind of statement. She had known. She had sat at that same Sunday dinner table where I told them about Daniel, processed every word, and then sat quietly while her husband planned this. Her composure wasn't innocent. It was participation. I made the mistake of looking around. I don't know what I was hoping to see, maybe confusion, maybe discomfort, maybe a single face reflecting back the disbelief I felt. Some people looked genuinely stunned, eyes wide, bodies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But others, and this was the part that stayed with me longest, were nodding. Slowly, solemnly nodding, the way congregation members do when a pastor confirms something they already privately believed. A woman 3 rows ahead of me turned slightly and found my face in the crowd. She didn't smile. She didn't offer sympathy. She simply looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pity mixed with judgment. I looked away and stared straight ahead. I don't remember making the decision to stand up. My body simply did it, rose quietly from the pew, moved along the side aisle, and walked toward the back doors while my father's voice continued filling the sanctuary behind me. I pushed through those heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the Atlanta morning, bright, warm, indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. The doors swung shut behind me with a sound that echoed. In the silence that followed, I stood on the top step and breathed. My hands were trembling. My jaw was tight. But I was outside. I was no longer sitting in that room absorbing it quietly, the way I had absorbed so many things quietly for so many years. I sat in my car for a long time before I called him. When Daniel answered, his voice was easy and warm. He had been at the park with Lily that morning, completely unaware that anything had happened. I told him everything, every word my father had said, every specific detail. I spoke steadily, without breaking, until I reached the end. Then the line was quiet for a moment. When Daniel spoke, he didn't express anger first. He didn't make it about himself. He simply said, "Genevieve, I need you to hear me clearly. What happened in that building today says everything about them and absolutely nothing about you." I closed my eyes, pressed the phone against my ear, and for the first time all morning I exhaled. I gave myself 7 days, no calls to my parents, no appearances at church. No explanations offered to anyone who reached out with questions wrapped in concern but loaded with judgment. Just silence, deliberate, chosen, and necessary. I spent that week walking, thinking, praying in my own quiet way, and letting the shock settle into something I could actually work with. Grief and humiliation are heavy together, but if you sit with them long enough without running, they eventually show you something useful underneath. By the end of that week, I was no longer shaking, I was still. Not the defeated kind of still, the kind that comes right before a person decides exactly who they are going to be going forward. On the eighth day, my phone rang, a number I recognized but hadn't expected. Ruth Abernathy. 64 years old, silver-haired, had attended my father's church for over 2 decades. She was not a gossip. She was not someone who involved herself in other people's business lightly. Which is exactly why, when she asked if she could speak with me privately, I said yes without hesitation. We met at a small diner near her neighborhood on a Tuesday morning. She ordered tea, wrapped both hands around the mug, looked at me steadily across the table, and said, "Genevieve, what happened to you last Sunday? I need you to know it was not the first time." I set down my coffee slowly. And I listened. Ruth spoke carefully and honestly for nearly an hour. She told me about a young man named Theo, publicly called out from that same pulpit 3 years ago for leaving the church's affiliated college program to pursue a music career. She told me about a woman named Carla, whose divorce was announced to the congregation before she had told her own children. She told me about a teenager, 17 years old, humiliated during a youth service for asking questions about faith that made the leadership uncomfortable. Each story followed the same architecture: a person who stepped outside approved boundaries, and a pulpit used as a weapon to bring them back in line. My father had a pattern. Ruth had watched it for years. Over the following 2 weeks, Ruth connected me with 4 other people who had experienced similar moments under my father's ministry. We didn't hold formal meetings. We talked privately, phone calls, quiet coffee shop conversations, a few message threads that grew longer with each passing day. Every person I spoke with carried the same particular weight: the specific exhaustion of someone who had been publicly diminished inside a space that promised safety. Some had left the church quietly and never looked back. Some still attended, sitting in those pews every Sunday with the memory lodged somewhere painful and unaddressed. None of them had ever spoken about it publicly. Each one, when I asked why, gave me the same answer. Who would believe me over Pastor Edmund? It was my friend Camille who first said it out loud. We were sitting on her apartment balcony one evening, the Atlanta skyline going amber behind the buildings, and I had just finished telling her everything: Ruth, the others, the full picture of what I was beginning to understand about my father's pattern. Camille listened without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Genevieve, what if you just told your story, not an attack? Not a campaign, just your truth, simply and clearly in your own words." I looked at her. "Online?" She nodded. "People need to hear this from someone who lived it, and you tell it better than anyone I know." I recorded it alone on a Friday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table. No ring light, no script, no dramatic music underneath. Just my face, natural light from the window, and the truth told as plainly as I knew how. I spoke about growing up in the church, about Daniel, about falling in love with a good man and being met with cold disapproval, about sitting in that sanctuary and hearing my name used as a cautionary tale. I didn't perform emotion, I simply spoke from the place where it actually lived. Honest, measured, and completely clear. When I finished recording, I watched it back once. My hands hesitated over the post button for a long moment, then I pressed it and closed my laptop. I posted the video at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday and went to bed shortly after. I had told Camille it was live. She sent back a single heart. Daniel called to say he was proud of me, that quiet, genuine pride in his voice that I had come to rely on completely. I lay in the dark thinking about Ruth, about Theo and Carla, and that 17-year-old who had simply asked honest questions and been made to feel ashamed for it. I thought about all the Sundays I had sat in that sanctuary and told myself that keeping peace was the same as keeping faith. I closed my eyes. Outside Atlanta hummed its usual nighttime rhythm. I had no idea that by morning, everything would be unrecognizable. I woke up at 6:43 a.m. to my phone vibrating continuously on the nightstand. I assumed it was morning notifications, the ordinary small noise of a regular day beginning. I picked it up without urgency. The screen was completely overwhelmed. Hundreds of comments, thousands of shares. My notifications had stopped loading individually and collapsed into a single relentless stream. I sat up slowly and opened the video. The view counter was sitting at 214,000. I stared at that number for a long moment, genuinely unable to process what I was seeing. I had gone to sleep expecting a few hundred views from people who might quietly understand. I woke up to something I had absolutely no framework for. I called Camille immediately. By Friday afternoon, the video had crossed 2 million views and was still climbing. My phone became essentially unusable for personal calls, every notification channel overwhelmed simultaneously. Three major media outlets had sent interview requests to my email. A faith based podcast with a significant following had already covered the story in a special episode released that same morning. Journalists were describing it as a story about religious abuse of power, about women silenced by institutional authority, about the weaponization of faith against personal dignity. Words I had lived but never assembled into that specific framework. Hearing my experience described that clearly, that publicly, by people who had never met me, was simultaneously validating and completely surreal. I made the decision to read the comments, not everyone, but enough to understand what was happening. What I found was not a mob, it was a mirror. Thousands of women describing their own versions of the same experience, shamed from pulpits, dismissed by religious parents, publicly humiliated for choices that threaten someone else's image of righteousness. Men writing about fathers who used scripture as a control mechanism. Former congregation members described the particular loneliness of being cast out of the only community they had ever known. Comment after comment after comment, each one a different person, a different story, the same underlying wound. I hadn't started a conversation. I had simply walked into one that had been waiting, quietly, painfully, for years. By Saturday morning, my father's church had released an official statement. It was posted on their website and shared across their social media platforms, carefully formatted, scripture referenced, and written in the particular language of institutional self-protection. It described the sermon as a moment of pastoral concern rooted in love. It referenced the sanctity of private family matters. It expressed regret that the message had been misunderstood by some. It did not use my name. It did not contain the word apology. It did not acknowledge the specific words spoken or the impact of speaking them publicly. It was, from the first sentence to the last, a document written entirely to protect one man's reputation. The internet read it that way immediately. Within hours of the church statement going live, the video crossed 6 million views. Media coverage accelerated rather than slowed. Commentators and journalists began dissecting the statement line by line, pointing to the absence of accountability, the deflection language, the careful avoidance of any direct acknowledgement of what had actually occurred. The phrase, misunderstood by some, became particularly viral, screenshot, shared, and responded to by hundreds of thousands of people who found it both revealing and infuriating. My father had spent decades carefully constructing a public image of wisdom and righteousness. That statement, intended to protect it, had instead placed it directly under a microscope, in front of an audience he could not influence or control. Something happened that I genuinely had not anticipated. People who had sat in my father's congregation for years, some for decades, began leaving. Not quietly slipping away, but publicly and deliberately. A family of 6 who had attended the church for 18 years posted their own video explaining their decision. A deacon submitted his resignation in a letter that was shared widely online. 3 separate women contacted local journalists to describe their own experiences of being publicly addressed from that same pulpit without consent. The community my parents had built their entire identity around was fracturing, not because of outside attack, but because people on the inside had finally found language for something they had long felt but never been able to name. On Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after the sermon that had started everything, I received a formal email from an organization called the Dignity Project, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting survivors of religious institutional harm. They had followed the story closely all week. They offered legal guidance, a platform to share my experience in a more structured setting, and connection to a national network of advocates working on faith community accountability. I read the email 3 times. A week ago, I had been sitting in my car outside a church, shaking and alone. Now an organization with national reach was offering to stand beside me formally. I forwarded the email to Camille. She responded in seconds. Genevieve, this is God, reply immediately. 3 weeks after the video, I agreed to meet my parents one final time. Not because I needed their approval. Not because I was hoping for a dramatic reconciliation scene that would wrap everything neatly. I agreed because I had spent my entire life speaking to them through softened words and careful omissions, and I wanted just once to speak plainly. The meeting was held at the office of a family counselor I trusted, neutral ground, witnessed, structured. I arrived early. Sat down. Arranged my notes on the table in front of me. When my parents walked in and saw those pages, I watched something flicker across my father's face. He had expected the daughter to keep peace. He found someone else entirely. My father opened the meeting the way he opened everything, with control, with framing, with the quiet assumption that he would set the terms of the conversation. He began explaining his intentions, his pastoral responsibility, his genuine concern for my future. I let him finish completely. Then I opened my notes and I spoke. I named specific dates. I described specific words. I outlined the pattern Ruth had described and the four other people whose stories I now carried alongside my own. I told him what it cost me to grow up needing his approval more than I needed my own voice. I did not raise my voice once. I did not soften a single sentence. I said every true thing I had swallowed for 32 years. I told them both directly, looking at each of them without flinching, what their actions had cost me. Not just the Sunday of the sermon, but the years before it. The constant quiet measurement. The love that arrived with conditions attached like fine print. The way I had learned to make myself smaller, more acceptable, less inconvenient to their image of what a pastor's daughter should be. I told my mother that her silence had never been neutral, that choosing not to intervene was its own very specific choice with its own very real consequences. I told my father that a pulpit is not a throne and a congregation is not a courtroom, and that the day he used both against his own daughter was the day he broke something that could not simply be repaired with scripture. My father maintained his composure through most of it, jaw tight, eyes steady, the practiced stillness of a man who had controlled rooms his entire adult life. But my mother, somewhere around the moment I described sitting in my car alone after the sermon, hands shaking, calling Daniel because I had no one else, something shifted in Gloria's face. The composure she had maintained her entire life, in every pew, at every dinner table, through every public performance of their perfect family, cracked. Her eyes filled, her hands, always so neatly folded, came apart. She didn't speak. But for the first time in my memory, my mother's face held something completely unguarded. Something real. It didn't fix anything. But it was honest. And honesty was more than I had expected. 2 weeks after our meeting, the church's governing board announced a formal internal review of pastoral conduct. 3 families had submitted official written complaints, each describing specific incidents of public shaming, 2 of them referencing experiences that predated mine by several years. The Dignity Project provided formal documentation supporting the review process. My father was placed on a temporary leave of ministry while the investigation proceeded. The church he had built over 30 years, the institution he had used as both his life's work and his personal instrument of control, was now examining itself because enough people had finally said, clearly and on record, that something had been wrong for a very long time. Accountability had arrived. Quietly, formally, completely. Daniel and I were married on a Saturday morning in early May. We held the ceremony in the garden of a small event space outside Atlanta, string lights in the trees, wildflowers everywhere, Georgia sunshine falling warm and generous across everything. Ruth was there, sitting in the front row in a yellow dress, crying happily from the moment I appeared. Camille stood beside me as my maid of honor. Lily, Daniel's daughter, my daughter now, walked ahead of me scattering petals with extraordinary seriousness and concentration. Daniel cried when he saw me. I cried when I saw him cry. The officiant was a woman of faith who believed that love, in all its forms, was always the correct answer. It was the most honest room I had ever stood in, so let me speak to you directly, because you stayed for all of it and that means something. Shame is a tool. It has always been a tool, wielded by people who need your silence to maintain their power. My father stood at that pulpit and used my name because he believed, after 32 years of it working, that I would absorb it quietly and fall back in line. 11 million people reminded him that silence has an expiration date. But here is what I want you to carry with you after this story ends. You do not need 11 million witnesses to validate your truth. You just need the courage to say it once, clearly, honestly, without apology. The rest has a way of taking care of itself.